There are certain factions in Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes that are especially important, and I've made faction guides for each of them. This video gives you an overview of which factions I recommend investing more heavily in the early and mid-game, and why. It's often beneficial to use characters from the same faction or class like Jedi, Rebels, or Scoundrels in combination because some of their abilities only work with others in their faction or class. While some mixed teams can be useful, truly standout mixed faction combinations are fairly rare nowadays, or are only useful in very specific circumstances. But besides faction synergy bonuses, to complete a number of game challenges and events, you will be required to use a full team from particular factions. As a result, new players will need to focus on more than one faction. But it is exceptionally easy for players to spread themselves too thinly, which is a recipe for failure and stagnation. Certain factions make much more sense for early to mid-game players to focus on heavily. This guide is meant for players who want to spend little or no money in this game and who therefore need to get characters who are farmable using free currency that the game grants to you each day. That currency is precious and easy to waste. Take my advice, which is also the advice of many other experts, and you will have as much success as a new free-to-play player can have. If you are a mid-game player and feeling stuck, this guide can also help you to refocus and regroup so you can get unstuck. So which factions should you focus on earlier in the game? Let's start with the light side. The Phoenix Rebels are solid in the squad arena, although you can also dominate with original trilogy Rebels if you strongly prefer that. Phoenix Rebels will also get you Palpatine and are required for Grand Admiral Thrawn. The Phoenix Rebels are crew members of 2 solid ships, both of which are required to obtain the Chimera capital ship later on, the best of the 4. Ezra and Kanan can also help you to get Grandmaster Yoda. Rebels are also required for Tenacity mod challenges. For newer players, there's no better bang for the buck in the game than the Phoenix characters. But there are a few other Rebels you should get early too. Check out my faction guide for Rebels for more details. The best alternative to Phoenix Rebels are other Rebels. But if you'd like, you can also go with the Jedi. Jedi are historically not a particularly strong faction. If they were, let's face it, almost everyone would play them and never want to spend money on the others, putting Capital Games out of business. But the Jedi have received some big boosts and new members recently. They're also needed to obtain Grandmaster Yoda and to complete the defense mod challenges. You can also put together a decent resistance squad by mid-game, and some of those are needed to unlock Jedi Training Rey and the speed mod challenges. Check out my faction guides for Rebels, Jedi, and the Resistance for more details. I would avoid the Ewoks, Galactic Republic, though most of those are Jedi, but they also include the Clone Troopers, Jawas, and the Old Republic characters, whom you probably can't get right now anyway, early in the game. Now, this doesn't mean to avoid all of the characters from these factions. It just means don't worry about having strong, complete squads of them until very late. You know, the kind that might compete effectively against other players in the squad arena. This is because they're not that strong and or because they're not required for any events or challenges until very, very late. The Rogue One Rebels have very limited need until very late in the game, and the Jawas are only needed for the low priority mod challenges. Check out my faction guide for Jawas for more details. You also don't need to worry about the Galactic Republic and its subfaction, the Clone Troopers. It's very weak with the exception that Rex is a superb all-around leader and Fives has a great ship, so you'll want those 2 Clone Troopers eventually. Now, onto the dark side. My top recommendation is the Empire faction. You don't necessarily need to focus on the Imperial Trooper subfaction. All Empire characters would be good early on. The Empire faction is large and it is powerful. It's also required for the potency mod challenges and for obtaining R2-D2, whom you'd want to get pretty early on in the game. It also includes 2 excellent Sith and both dark side fleet commanders. Check out my faction guide for the Empire for more details. Perhaps the best alternative for the Empire is the First Order. The First Order is a much smaller faction, so your options are limited earlier in the game, and you'll need to mix in non-First Order units for a little while. But you can build a very powerful team with them by the mid-game, and they're also needed for the offense mod challenges. Check out my faction guide for the First Order for more details. Early on in the game, I'd avoid the Night Sisters. They are very good, but you won't be able to put together a solid Night Sister squad until later in the game. Sith are currently very dominant, but you can't get some of the best Sith until much later in the game, and they aren't needed for key events or challenges. Eventually, I may release faction guide videos for the Night Sisters and Sith, but since they're late game factions, they're lower priorities for me. Separatists and their Geonosian Separatist subfaction are not terribly strong, nor are they needed for any event or challenge, although a couple of them have good ships, but again, nothing you'll need early in the game. And Tuscans are basically useless. Now there are two game classes, I wouldn't call them factions per se, because there's no hierarchy in them, that include both light and dark side characters, so they're purple here. My top recommendation are the Scoundrels. You need Scoundrels for the Credit Heist event, which gets you all important credits. This is a high priority. You don't need to focus entirely on the Bounty Hunter subclass of the Scoundrels, so any Scoundrel will do for this event. Check out my faction guide for Scoundrels for more details. The other mixed class in the game are the droids. Droids are decent, and a few of them are essential. You're going to want to get R2-D2, BB-8, you're going to want to get IG-88 pretty quickly, but you currently don't need an all-droid team in any major game event that you have to worry about for a very long time. Eventually, I may release a faction guide video for droids, but again, because you don't really need an all-droid faction, it's a low priority for me as well. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think, and then check out my faction-specific guides in the rest of this series.